Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us. Welcome back to Post Talk Live. I am Drew Armstrong, executive editor of Endpoints News. It is Tuesday, July 29, and last week we had an emergency episode about Sarepta and everything that is going on at the controversial biotech. Enough has happened since that episode that we decided we needed to do another one. And so here we are today. In the last week, we have had an FDA official or officials make a bunch of comments to media, including Endpoints, saying how unlikely it was that this gene therapy for Duchenne patients was ever going to come back to market. And then yesterday, the FDA reversed course and said it would allow the company to start shipping the therapy to some younger patients. In between, there's been a conservative pressure campaign focused on a top FDA official, a ton of wild market moves, big questions about the future of the company, and patients have been stuck in the middle of all of this. Joining me today is Brian Skorney. He's a stock analyst at Baird who has followed Sarepta for years. We're going to hear all about that. We're going to talk with him about the events of the last 2 weeks and what it tells us about the FDA and the future of the regulator. A couple of quick housekeeping items. If you are joining us for the first time here on Post Talk Live, hello, and thank you for being with us. Our show brings you the reporting, analysis, and debate that usually happens behind the scenes in our newsroom live to you. If you are joining us on YouTube and you're not already following us, go to that little subscribe button at the bottom of your screen and you'll get alerts about future live streams. You can also sign up for the Post Talk email on your Endpoints News subscription page, which if you already are, you got one of our columns that came out earlier today, and you will get more of those in the future. You'll also hear about future episodes, including one I'm looking forward to later this week, a part 2 of our China series with Jefferies China analyst Kui, and a follow-up to an episode we had earlier this month. Now, if you're joining us on YouTube, you'll see a little chat box on the right-hand side of the screen. Feel free to ask us questions there. They'll get fed to me by our producers, and hopefully we'll get to some of them. And if you miss us live, our recordings are going to live on YouTube as well as Spotify and Apple Podcasts. So with that, Brian, welcome to the show. I want to, I want to just kind of lens way back here and talk about why are we having you on the show? You've been following this company for years, and like, if you were having to describe what makes Sarepta so interesting and controversial to someone who was, someone who's coming in and just didn't know a whole lot about this, like, what is the deal with this company, and why do we all care so much?
Yeah, thanks for having me on. I'm thrilled to be here. I love talking Sarepta. I've been following this company for 12 years. So I think I am the longest tenured sell side analyst covering the name seamlessly. And probably 5 years into covering it, 2018, people would call me and be like, "Oh my God, Sarepta, so much chaos," and I'd be like, "Yep, only for the last 5 years." So since 5 years through 12 years, it's basically the same thing. It's just been a controversial name ever since I can remember looking at it the first time, going all the way back to its first approval controversy with the Teplerson, which I think is relevant for the conversation today.
Yeah.
And look, I mean, I think it's very simple. Why is it such a controversial story where there's so many moving parts? It is really kind of a central figure in multiple stakeholders and how we evaluate drugs for clinical effectiveness and clinical safety. And because of the way that we have seen data come from all of their programs, I think it's very ambiguous, and you wind up with basically this kind of Rorschach test to determine what your bias is to bring into it, right? And I think to kind of like go over a couple of the stakeholders here, right? You have all these regulatory stakeholders where we've sort of set up this measure. It's a legislative measure, but we call it substantial evidence of effectiveness on a clinically meaningful endpoint, or in the case of accelerated approval, substantial evidence of effectiveness on a surrogate endpoint that's reasonably likely to predict clinical benefit. And you would think those are two straightforward sentences, but they're really not. And there's a lot of subjectivity that goes into it. And because of that subjectivity, when you don't have just clear, overwhelming evidence, it becomes a big debate point. And That's sort of the regulatory side of things. I think the most important stakeholders here are really the families who are most affected by this disease, families who have boys, or in the rare case, a girl with Duchenne muscular dystrophy. I mean, this is, a really, really horrible disease to deal with. It's been 100% fatal for people who wind up getting diagnosed with Duchenne muscular dystrophy. It would seem like there is, at least to some extent, a straightforward biological way of approaching this disease, because these patients are missing one protein, dystrophin. And if you could find the way to replace dystrophin in these patients, then theoretically, you should have high conviction that would phenotypically change the outcomes for these patients, right? And that's what a number of companies have been trying to do. You obviously have stockholders who are impassioned one way or the other, and you sort of deal with this, is it going to get approved? Is it not going to get approved? Is it going to sell well with an accelerated approval, or not going to sell well with an accelerated approval? Will payers pay for it? Will parents and patients and physicians demand it? Will they not? And these are the debates that have been going on since, really since the Sarepta kind of published their first, or presented their first phase 2 data for eteplirsen way back in, I want to say 2012 at this point. And that brings us to where we are today. It continues to be controversial because none of they have not shown in a randomized clinical study a prospectively defined hit on a primary endpoint for function. And therefore, you just don't have sort of the clear-cut evidence of effectiveness that one ideally wants. And now we struggle with, what is enough evidence, and what is enough evidence to kind of support up against a safety profile, where in the case of Elevidys, this gene therapy, there has been 2 deaths that we know of in the Duchenne muscular dystrophy patient population that are, pretty directly attributable to liver toxicity induced by high doses of this vector, AAV. And that's kind of where we sit now. And, we have tons and tons we could talk about over the history or the current state. And well, that's just where we sit.
And we'll get in. We're going to spend most of our time, I would say, on the last couple of weeks and months. But I should say, as a preface to that, like, we in the, folks who cover biotech or who are in biotech have been talking about versions of this that bridge to prior administrations, Democratic in nature, other top FDA officials. I mean, we have seen versions of this type of controversy play out under Janet Woodcock, under Peter Marks, where, you have this intersection, it feels like, of, ambiguity around science, around a regulator trying to decide what is the role of the regulator in a brand new field, lacking, the evidence that they might prefer to have, and huge amounts of patient pressure, and people, making what I think, like, most charitably we could call a lot of very imperfect decisions if you were thinking about, like, what the platonic ideal of a regulator is. So we're going to get into all of that, but I want to preface all of this by saying and acknowledging, because I'm sure I will get emails and tweets about this, that, like, yes, we're hyper aware of all the things that have happened under, prior leadership of the FDA that have their own controversies attached to them. So I think the question I want to start with, here is, I want to go right to the heart of what happened here, and the FDA's decision to reverse and now say, after, I guess, a week of getting the company to agree, hey, we're not gonna, we're gonna do a pause, and then all of a sudden reversing that pause. When you look at that decision, you read the FDA statement that came out today. What was your read on that action? Like, does this do the things that FDA has raised around their questions around safety, do those feel resolved? And, hey, like, let's put this to bed. We did our pause. We've satisfied our scientific questions here. Pause is over. Let it back on the market. Or do you still have more questions about this?
I mean, I have tons of questions, and I'll sort of say, look, I mean, there's always sort of this gut statement that comes out I do it, you guys do it. Everyone sort of does it. It's like, oh, the FDA said this, the FDA did this, the FDA did that. And I constantly have to remind myself and other people, like, the FDA is not a monolith, right? And
Mhm.
companies get mad at me all the time when they'll be like, oh, well, the FDA told this to us in a meeting. I'll be like, who? Because you have a review meeting with the FDA and there's like 40 people in the meeting, right? And one person may say one thing, but another person who may be more important didn't say anything, and you don't know what that person thinks, right? So I think what you're seeing to some extent play out in these press releases is this is not the FDA monolith, but these are different stakeholders within the FDA, different people in different positions of power who are providing, effectively totally different commentary, right? I don't want to try to force the issue of who at the FDA said what last week in terms of communicating things to the press, but I would bet the person who communicated those things last week is not the same person who came up with the press release that went out last night, right?
Yeah.
And we could point out tons of other instances in the FDA where I'll say, look, here's a clear case where someone at the FDA does one thing, but someone above them comes over the top and makes an entirely different
Hmm.
decision. So
Hmm.
this isn't the first time. This won't be the last time. This is maybe a little more chaotic than we're used to, but I think it just kind of reflects that dynamic that there are different powers within the FDA that have different positions. And it goes back to what I said before. This is not clear data, so it's very easy for me to kind of try to pull back objectively and say, I don't know who's right. I
Right.
see arguments on both sides. What I think is wrong is just how sort of chaotic the FDA has been over the last 2 weeks about addressing some of these.
Yeah, and just to kind of catch our readers up, I think people have been paying very close attention to this story, but you mentioned these media reports, and I think just to give people a sense of exactly what happened, because I think all of us are trying to make sense of this. I believe on Tuesday, Stat News had a story, saying with an FDA official unnamed speaking on background, saying something along the lines of there's very little possibility of a path back to market for this therapy. And then on Wednesday, a government official describing the FDA spoke to Bloomberg, making somewhat similar comments, but basically saying they would need to be shown that this drug was safe. And then in Endpoints on Thursday, in a story and an update we ran, spoke to a senior FDA official and ran comments saying essentially, unanimous decision by the folks involved in this, that this shouldn't be back on the market and that there would need to be additional study. And then we in a subsequent conversation we had with that person, added information to the story later in the day saying, hey, they would need to run an additional study, would need to prove some changes in the dosing, that those dosing are safe. Stock is whipsawing all through this. And I need to add the caveat here that, we obviously have no insight to who Stat or Bloomberg spoke to. We don't know if they're the same person that we spoke to. I've been in media a long time. I kind of presume that maybe they would be, but I genuinely have no idea. And I can't share any insight to that. And we obviously aren't going to disclose who we spoke to. But yeah, I mean, you're seeing this kind of regulation play out in public in a very, very chaotic way, which that to me, I think, and Brian, you mentioned this, like the question of like, hey, who did you speak to at the FDA? I think the question it raises for me is, again, the FDA will never be a monolith, but a lot of times it feels monolithic to those of us looking in from the outside because I think they tend to be quite careful about their disclosures, especially about live regulatory situations or applications. And so that they don't let that type of chaos leak out into the outside world, even though the conversation with a company or in private might be very different.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a new perspective over the
Yeah.
last 2 weeks on how the FDA operates.
Um, there was, I think, and you had raised some of this as well. I think some genuine questions about whether Sarepta could survive this if their drug stayed off the market. Can you lay out the financial story here and just exactly what the risks were there and whether you think that those still exist. I mean, I have like I have a hard time imagining that we will see yet another reversal here. But I mean, can you kind of just lay out the nuts and bolts, Kate, on the finances of why this was such a big deal, for the company and why it seemed to put them at such meaningful kind of corporate risk?
Yeah, so look, the company has three products that are approved, these PMO drugs that are, I think become relevant in a broader conversation about both the existence of the company and their ability to meet certain debt obligations, as well as, a lot of this regulatory framework. I mean, these are a set of assets that do, more than $800 million in sales a year. I mean, more than $900 million last year. Probably, we have a model to do around 900 million this year. Those products alone, so that, almost $1 billion franchise has never really generated a profit for Sarepta. So at least the structure that they've been operating under over the last few years has really been built up around sort of these gene therapies, which are costly to manufacture, has been costly in R&D. So it's really depended future-wise on at least running at the same sort of operating expenditures success of Elevidys as a commercial product. And I think there's no question that at the outset demand was very robust, very, very high. I think there's been a lot of questions about like the durability. Like you have this warehouse effect where a lot of people with DMD come in over the first 6, 9, 12 months, they get treated. Once they're through, you're working more towards an incidence. So and want to say like COVID vaccines as an example, or Hep C as an example, but there's sort of this debate around like what does the area under the curve look like for a cure, where we're so used to looking at treatments which just kind of generally go up and to the right until patent expiration, right? So there's been a lot of debates, but I think it was very clear, they started generating a profit with Elevidys's launch. The launch was very robust. People had, billions and billions of sales in their model. And it's sort of started to run into a little bit of a plateau. And then we started having some of these safety issues. And once the initial safety issues sort of came to light, the company started, revising guidance downwards. And 2 weeks ago, in light of lower demand, they sort of did this restructuring. Basically, because I think the investor pushback was like, whoa, if you're seeing declining in Elevidys sales, like, can you actually meet these obligations? And the two primary obligations that is they have a sizable debt position, and they have a number of milestones with their partner Arrowhead that are payable in the near term. Just yesterday, Arrowhead announced that they achieved a $100 million milestone, right? So there's $100 million out from Sarepta. Sarepta has a sizable cash balance, but with their operating costs, there's a lot of concerns. What do they need to kind of meet the debt obligations here? And Sarepta did a pretty good job 2 weeks ago, kind of laying out the restructuring and saying, we have this base case scenario where, we can meet all of these obligations if we see as low as $500 million in Elevidys sales, right? So for right or wrong, that's sort of like the hurdle they set up to say,
Got it.
we can meet all these obligations as long as we do 500 million in Elevidys sales. And then in the subsequent days, things really blew up with this whole regulatory withdrawal and now reintroduction. And the question is, was 500 actually, is that even doable? And if you're not going to do 500, what does that mean for your debt obligation? So, certainly if the drug is off the market, there's a huge issue, right? They didn't model the restructuring to say there's going to be zero Elevidys sales. A lot of people are trying to work through the PMO sales, and can this PMO sales, if they really, really aggressively cut OpEx yet again, can that sort of sustain the business and meet the debt? But there's concerns about longevity of those two. But that's sort of where we sit and why this is becoming such an existential risk for Sarepta as a company.
Is this, I mean, there've been a lot of questions about, I think, I've seen some folks on the sell side raise this, like management credibility. And like, I think like a lot of times when you see companies like this with this level of volatility, with these type of, problems with regulators, the kind of corporate instability and regulator instability we're seeing. Like people start asking, like, hey, is there going to be a change here? Whether it's an activist, whether it's an asset that's better owned by a big, boring pharma company that does this stuff all day. I mean, and this has been a very outspoken advocacy driving management. Like, do you ever wonder? I mean, is that something that's been on your radar that someone might come in here and be a different or better, owner of this asset, or does that just seem impossible given where management and board have been on this? And I mean, we joke that like it feels like for every time they get into a controversy, they get out of it. I mean, these guys seem in some ways a little bit Teflon, as long as you don't look at the stock price.
Yeah. So look, I mean, right, there's multiple questions about management credibility and is this the right management team to go forward? I would say if you're looking for someone who's better at handling regulatory, they don't exist. and right, like the running joke is, and I think Wilson Bryant, who is the former OTP director at CBRA, after he departed, I think, I don't know if it was in Endpoints or one of the other journals, he had the funny quip when Elevidus got accelerated approval that there seems to be one regulatory hurdle for
Yeah.
Sarepta and another regulatory hurdle for everyone else. So I mean, if you're looking for a team that is good at managing regulatory, I,
Yeah, I guess for all the
despite
noise,
what's happened,
it's hard to argue with the results. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's hard to argue with that. Look, is there a different team who would be better placed in sort of a company that is really struggling with existence? Like, do you want a turnaround team here? I think it's hard to say. I mean, it's hard to imagine who would kind of come in at this juncture and effectively fix things, because so much of it is tied to regulatory for now. And I guess with the FDA press release last night, one would argue, and I don't know how much sway management had in getting the FDA to relent, but one way or the other, like the FDA
Yeah.
certainly 180'd. Whether Sarepta management deserves credit for that, or a myriad of other factors are just coincidental to affect that. I think they kind of are in a decent position to survive this right now. We'll have to see what sales ultimately look like. We'll have to see what profitability looks like over the next coming quarters. And if there's another regulatory shoe to drop, certainly we'll have to see how they survive that. But yeah, I mean, before the reversal yesterday, I think there was a lot of pressure on management. There was a lot of criticism of could they even survive, the next couple of days. And look, I mean, it still remains to be seen. 1 p.m. kind of emailed me, but what CEO would actually take this job? Because it's such a difficult position to be in right
Yeah. Who owns this stock now? I mean, I guess like has this become like a retail and hedge fund toy for a lot of people, just given the volatility here? I mean, I mean, talk to me like when you talk to folks in the market, like who is buying this thing and owning this thing? Like, and when we look at the shareholders.
Yeah, I mean, I would say it is. My conversations are definitely not with long-term mutual fund holders over the last 2 weeks. That there's clearly been, I would argue, a shift in ownership, kind of post Peter Marx's approval decision. Where ownership has really turned over from this idea where when we saw the first 4 patients worth of data, or going into the first phase 2 results, I think there was like this general consensus of they may have cured. I hate to use the word cure, but like phenotypically changed these patients, right? Like
Yeah.
this gene therapy produces a ton of this engineered dystrophin, and the bioplausibility argument was very strong. Like you could, is there a chance that you could give this to a 4-year-old and they may not die of Duchenne muscular dystrophy? I think there was a lot of hope kind of resting on that among people who were long biased institutional holders. Since sort of it's become very controversial in the failure of the 2 randomized controlled studies and sort of the debate around Peter Marx's decision to seemingly overturn the review division's recommendation to not approve this and approve it. there's a lot of hedge fund involvement, and I would say they move quick, right? So like any given
Yeah.
day, like one, a fund could be very long, and then 4 weeks later, they're very short. And just the sheer volatility of the stock in the last couple of years, couple of years too, but a couple of weeks certainly caters to more of that kind of crowd. There's always been some element of retail, and you don't have to go very far on Twitter to see that there's a
Yeah.
lot of opinions on the retail side too.
I try not to dig into too much of that stuff. That feels like a place where I'm it's better for my mental health not to go. But um uh, you mentioned, and we I think have been following this quite closely. It's been really interesting to watch some of this kind of conservative pressure machine spin up. I mean, Laura Loomer, who, is like, for people who don't know her, she's a, conservative, online conservative activist who's very, very close to Trump and has successfully forced the exit of a handful of people she saw and pulled dossiers on that were seen as disloyal to Trump because of past support for Democrats. She pulled together kind of a similar attack against the Sieber head, Vinay Prasad. She does a lot of this, I should say. Not all of it lands, but I think what has been interesting is to see kind of the Wall Street Journal pile on, Newsmax. There's really clearly kind of a conservative, or right-wing pressure campaign that seems very aimed at, Prasad over the last 2 weeks and this particular issue. And then we saw this reversal. What are your thoughts on that? I mean, I know I think it's going to be impossible right now for us to know, the exact cause and effect here. It certainly looks to me like, there's some political pressure that may have forced this, given what we saw, the reasons raised as concerns and then not, but again, like unknowable ultimately here. But like, what's your read on that? And then I think what the ripple effect of that is. People have mentioned like Replimune as, Replimune stock is up like 20% today. I think people hoping that, oh, maybe they'll flip on that too. How do you read all this? Right? How are you trying to make sense of what we're seeing there and what it says about, how FDA might be treated kind of as an apparatus in the larger public discourse, or how companies or advocacy groups interact with the FDA?
Yeah, so I think it goes back to what I was saying before. I think the FDA. Look, I mean, I think we like to think of the FDA as like a science-based organization, and is it above sort of political discourse and political pressure? I would argue, I think that we are seeing an elevation of at least sort of the public view of the political pressures that happen at the FDA. I wouldn't necessarily say they're entirely new, though, right? And it goes back to your
Yeah.
comment before. In prior
Yeah, of course.
administrations, we've
Yes.
we've
Yeah.
seen things get swayed by politics, Republican administrations, Democratic administrations. And look, I mean, really, I mean, is anything not political? I mean,
Right.
politics determines law determines how we approve or don't approve these drugs. So everything's to some extent political. Look, I've sort of been saying since Vinay got appointed to Sieber, and look, I mean, I in many ways I think the world of Vinay. I think he's a really smart, analytical person. He sees things in the clinical trial data that I think are very hard to see, and he's very good at that analysis. But I think he's also a very vocal, almost activist regulator. It's funny to see, and I think this has happened with a lot of COVID. Um, the post-COVID bedfellows are very interesting to me because Vinay was very critical of regulatory mandates for masking for the vaccine, and that sort of put him in the same framework as RFK Jr. and a lot of like the Trump MAGA supporters, right? But I find it crazy that he has such a history of publicly disputing a lot of the other parts of the administration and RFK Jr. and it's hard for me to think that it wasn't going to eventually come to something like this, right? So I mean, look, I mean,
Yeah.
I'm not someone who follows Laura Loomer and thinks she's an insightful person, but she's not wrong on this. Like
Yeah.
Vinay is a a round peg in a square hole as CBER director in this administration. He is, if anything, an overregulator, right? And I don't necessarily agree that I would say he's an overregulator, but certainly compared to like what the GOP standards are for
Yeah, I mean,
access.
he's never been the kind of like libertarian, let it all
Right.
through, safety's good enough that we have seen, some other folks be, put forward for and kind of have that viewpoint. Yeah, it's a really interesting kind of contradiction or tension that I don't think
Yeah.
we know how it's going to resolve yet.
Yeah, so I think it's fair to say, like what you pointed out, the sort of right-leaning pressure to kind of unmask him as sort of like this democratic socialist person who's very pro-regulation. It's not incorrect, and and we put in a note today, right? Either it probably signals that he's on the way out the door, or he's at least very significantly muzzled now, knowing anything he really puts himself out there for that is, somewhat contradictory to what RFK or Trump or, I don't know who is the decision maker here coming in from the top, but his decisions are, reversible by the administration, or, he could be told to back down. And I don't know. I mean, Vinay has never struck me as a person who's like going to back down. So I kind of feel like it signals, a resignation not too long down the road. But either way, you're right. Like these stocks are going up because he very clearly has a much different hurdle for a lot of these indications, and he stated as much over 10 years of publications than like a Peter Marks. And that is, for the stocks, having that sort of regulatory view is negative. And any indication that the stringency that he brings to CBER would be cut back is a positive for these stocks.
Yeah. Well, let me use this as a quick flip to just the last question here. I mean, this has been an insane 2 weeks. A lot of news, a lot of news. What are the next one or two things you're watching on this story, or do you think might play out, or kind of key inflection points we need to wait and see on here?
Well, I think we have to see. Well, I think broadly for the sector, I think and it'll be very interesting to see how Vinay survives what just happened within the FDA. I'm interested to see, what public commentary Macari makes about what just transpired. I'm very interested to see if Vinay shows up. He's been doing a lot of public outreach prior to this alongside Macari. So, I think we're all interested to see how this plays out in terms of what the FDA regulatory bar looks like across things. For Sarepta specifically, I mean, I think we'll be looking at what patient demand winds up looking like, right? You know, Part of the concerns going into this temporary hold that was put in place was, are parents now concerned enough, given the controversy of the approval, given sort of the ambiguity of the data, with the very real deaths that have occurred in a couple of patients, you're weighing something different. And this is where I just find like the whole thing so tragic to read about, some of these individual cases of parents struggling with, oh, do we expose our kids to something that can kill them, for the hope that, the anecdotes of benefit that we see among some of these patients that have been treated 4, 5, 6 years ago are real, and not just sort of figments of the imagination. It really pulls on the heartstrings to kind of consider the, options before these families.
Yeah. Well, we are going to be following this story closely. I know you will, as you have for the last 12 years. And I don't know if that's a badge of honor or a punishment, but thank you for doing it. Brian Skorney, thank you so much for being here on Post Talk Live today. That is all the time we have. I hope everybody here will tune in on Friday for our follow-up China episode. I'm very excited about that one. We'll be joined by Jefferies analyst Kwee from Hong Kong. The recording of this conversation will live on YouTube, and audio will be up on Spotify and Apple Podcasts within a few hours. If you've signed up for our Post Talk newsletter, you'll get notifications when we have a new broadcast coming up. If you're not signed up, head over to endpoints.news, that's .news.com, not.com. And then on the top right-hand corner, you can hit your reader profile link, then preferences, and click to activate Post Talk. You can also follow us on X, LinkedIn, YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Blue Sky by searching for Endpoints News. I am Drew Armstrong, executive editor of Endpoints. A huge thank you to our producer, Nicole Wetzman, and our engineer, Dalen Turk. We will see you the next time news breaks.